Hello everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel. Watch my video and subscribe my channel. Eric's last words shock everyone after confessing the most devastating family truth. Eric Forrester lay in his favorite armchair in the grand Forrester living room, the weight of decades pressing down on his chest like an invisible stone, his eyes reflecting a mixture of regret, sorrow, and the flickering embers of a love that had once been as unshakable as the foundations of the mansion itself. And as his children, grandchildren, and the extended Forrester and Logan families gathered around in tense, suffocating silence, none of them could have anticipated that the patriarch, who had held them all together through betrayals, business wars, forbidden romances, and family feuds, was about to speak words that would unravel everything they thought they knew. For Eric, his voice trembling yet deliberate, confessed that the very fabric of their family tree was rooted in a devastating truth he had buried for decades. A truth so shattering it could rewrite alliances, destroy marriages, and recast enemies as siblings, lovers as unintended rivals, and allies as bloodbound strangers. He spoke of a night long before Ridge's birth, before Stephanie's unrelenting iron grip on the Forrester dynasty had cemented their place as Los Angeles royalty, a night when, in his youthful arrogance and blinded by an intoxicating mix of ambition and desire, he had made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life, a choice that created a rift between two women, Stephanie and Brooke's mother, Beth Logan, that had never been healed, because that night he had fathered a child not with the woman he later married and built a fashion empire with, but with the woman he turned away, setting in motion a decades-long lie that meant Ridge Forrester was not his biological son, that the man who carried his name, his vision, his legacy was in fact the product of a betrayal Eric himself orchestrated. And as gasps rippled across the room, Brooke's hands flew to her mouth, tears springing forth as she turned to Ridge, whose face had gone pale as marble, his blue eyes searching the room as if its ornate columns and gold-trimmed frames could somehow anchor his spinning reality, while Steffi clutched Finn's arm, her mind racing back through every Forrester holiday, every boardroom war with the Logans, every bitter word she had ever spat about bloodlines and legacy, and Thomas's jaw clenched so tightly that the veins in his neck stood out, his designer shirt collar constricting his breath as he realized that the dynasty he had sacrificed his morality for might never have been theirs to begin with. And in that instant, Eric, weakened by the illness that had been gnawing at his body like a silent vulture, forced himself to sit up straighter, his trembling fingers gripping the armrests, as if he could hold back death just long enough to say everything he had left unsaid. And he revealed that it was not only Ridge whose paternity had been a secret forged in the fires of passion and fear, but that he had also covered up the truth about Bridget's conception, manipulating medical records, bribing a doctor long since dead, and even threatening Stephanie with the loss of everything if she ever breathed a word, because Eric had been convinced, in those formative years of Forrester creations, that a scandal would destroy not only the family name but the empire itself. And so he had lived with that poison in his veins, watching his children fight, watching Brooke and Ridge's love story rise and crumble, and rise again like a cursed tide, never daring to tell them that they were all building castles on sand. And now, as Katie wiped a tear from her cheek and whispered to Donna whether this meant their entire rivalry with the Forresters had been nothing more than a tragic farce, and as Hope stepped forward, her voice cracking as she begged Eric to explain what this meant for her, for Douglas, for the man she had loved and lost in the whirlwind of Thomas's obsession, Eric's lips quivered with the weight of yet another truth, that the woman everyone believed to be dead, the one who had set this family ablaze over the past year with her schemes, Luna Nozua, was not only alive but connected to this web in ways none of them had imagined. For Lee Finnegan, in her ruthless desire to protect her family, had hidden Luna away not because of guilt over her actions, but because Luna carried the proof of Eric's betrayal in her veins, a genetic echo that tied the Spencers, the Logans, and the Forresters together in a tangled tapestry of deception. And when Eric said, "I did it for love, for the empire, but I failed you all," the words hung in the air like smoke over a battlefield. Ridge staggered backward, his mind clawing for something real to hold onto as Taylor reached for him, her voice a frantic whisper, pleading for him to breathe, to focus, to not let this kill him too, while Brooke, caught between vindication and devastation, remembered every moment Stephanie had used the word Logan as a weapon, every time she had been called an outsider, and now, with the patriarch himself saying that the walls between their families had been built on his lies, she felt both freed and broken, because if Ridge was not Eric's son, then what had all of her sacrifices, her loyalty, her endless tug-of-war with Taylor been for? And as the grandfather clock chimed in the distance, its pendulum swinging like a heartbeat counting down Eric's remaining minutes, Zend, Paris, and even Bill Spencer, who had come only to gloat over Eric's failing health, stood frozen, the usually sharp-tongued mogul finding himself speechless for once as his mind calculated what this meant for his sons, for Liam's daughter with Steffi, for Will's connection to the Forresters, because this revelation had the power to upend corporate contracts, inheritance stakes, and the very soul of the fashion world in Los Angeles. And Eric, seeing the chaos ripple through the room like an earthquake, spreading cracks through polished marble, whispered one more line that silenced even the most hardened among them. The man you all trusted, the man you built your lives around, was a coward, and I cannot die with this lie in my heart. And in that moment, as Bridget rushed to check his pulse, fearing that his heart, strained by both illness and the burden of decades of deceit, might give out before he could finish, Eric turned his gaze toward Quinn's portrait on the wall, the ghost of his recent past staring down at him with a smirk that now felt like a curse. And he realized that this was only the beginning of the reckoning, because what he had just confessed was only the first layer, and the true devastation was yet to come for Eric Forrester. The king of this gilded cage was ready to name names, to open letters long locked away, and to show them that the family they thought they knew was an illusion crafted not by destiny, but by his desperate hands. The room felt like it was caving in on itself as Eric's confession sent invisible shockwaves across every corner of the Forrester mansion, and though the chandeliers still gleamed above and the champagne glasses from earlier celebrations still clinked in faint echoes from the kitchen, it was as though the air had turned to lead, suffocating everyone inside. Ridge's legs buckled under the weight of the revelation, and he stumbled back into the sofa, his usually commanding presence reduced to a hollow shell. The man who had once declared himself the true heir of Forrester Creations, now questioning his very identity, his hands clawing at his chest as though he could rip out the ache spreading through his rib cage. And Taylor dropped to her knees before him, cupping his face with trembling hands, her eyes frantic, yet flooded with a strange mixture of pity and rage, because while part of her wanted to hold him and whisper that blood didn't matter, that their love and family could survive the storm, another part of her, a darker, long-suppressed fragment of her heart, wanted to look at Eric and scream, to demand why he had let her build her life on a lie, why he had stood silently as she and Brooke waged their endless war over a man who might never have truly belonged to this dynasty, and Brooke herself could no longer stand. Still, pacing across the Persian rug, her blonde hair falling in waves that caught the light of the setting sun, her mind a kaleidoscope of moments, Ridge proposing to her with the Forrester ring, Stephanie telling her she would never belong, the first time Eric had smiled at her as if she were the future of his house, and now it all twisted like broken glass underfoot, because if Ridge was not Eric's son, then perhaps their love was not destiny, but something born of a misconception they had both been too blind to question. And Steffi, strong, fierce, proud Steffi, felt her knees weaken, memories of her own claims to the Forrester throne flashing through her mind, the speeches about legacy, about bloodlines, about how her children with Liam or Finn carried the future in their veins. And now, with Eric saying that the foundation was rotten from the start, she wondered if she had been fighting the wrong battles, claiming the wrong empire, and Finn, ever the doctor, ever the rational anchor in her stormy world, held her close but kept his gaze locked on Eric, not with hatred, but with a deep, probing need for the whole truth, because he knew this was only the first domino, and the collapse would not stop here. And across the room, Donna clung to Katie, whispering that this might explain so much, the endless rivalries, the uncanny patterns of betrayal that had haunted this family like a curse. And Katie, her heart still bruised by Bill's betrayals and her own wavering faith in love, couldn't help but wonder whether this truth might free them all or finish them. Because if the Forrester empire was a lie, then what was left for any of them to hold on to? And then Thomas, whose entire existence had been a relentless pursuit of respect, control, and redemption, stepped forward, his eyes burning with something feral, his mind calculating what this could mean for Douglas, for Hope, for the legacy he had sacrificed his soul to preserve. And he asked the question that made Eric's eyes close as if pierced by a blade. Who is my father, then? Who are we if you lied about Ridge? Are we your children? Or are we merely names you used to create your kingdom? Eric's lips parted, but no sound came, only the ghost of another truth, one heavier than the first. Bill Spencer, who had been leaning in the doorway like a predator watching prey unravel, decided to step into the light, his voice slick with false sympathy as he said, Well, the mighty Forrester house of cards finally falls, and though his words dripped with satisfaction, did this indicate Massimo Marone had been correct all along? Was Luna's survival a missing piece? Eric's breathing grew shallow, Bridget kneeling beside him with a stethoscope trembling in her hands, warning everyone that the stress could kill him before he revealed the rest. And yet Eric shook his head weakly, insisting that he would not leave this world with only half the truth spoken, and so he forced the words out, each syllable a dagger to his children's hearts. It wasn't just one mistake. It was a pattern, a sickness of control. I decided who would matter, and I made sure the world would believe it, even if it meant rewriting your lives. And suddenly the memories came rushing back to those who had been there in the early years, Taylor recalling a conversation with Stephanie about falsified documents, Brooke remembering strange disappearances of medical files during her first pregnancy, even Ridge himself remembering how certain questions about his blood type had always been brushed aside with laughter and champagne. And in the corner, unnoticed until now, Hope stood frozen, her hands trembling over her stomach as she whispered to herself, If this is true, then everything I've done, everything I've forgiven Thomas for, everything I've fought for, it's been built on a ghost. And the clock ticked on, the golden light fading into dusk, casting long shadows across portraits of a family that might never have truly existed as painted. And still Eric spoke, his voice now rasping with both urgency and surrender, revealing that the reason he had hidden Luna's supposed death, the reason Lee had gone to such extremes, was because Luna carried not just a scandal but a genetic connection that, if exposed, would have proven decades ago that the Forrester legacy was shared with the very family they had shunned. The Buckinghams, the Spencers, the Marones, a web so tangled that not even DNA could cleanly cut through it now. And as Sheila Carter, of all people, stepped out from the back hallway where she had been lurking after being invited under the guise of a peacekeeping attempt, her lips curved into a smile so fragile it almost looked human, because for once in her chaotic, villainous life, she was not the one destroying them. They were destroying themselves, and she whispered to Finn, loud enough for Steffi to hear, You see, sweetheart? Sometimes the truth is the real bullet. And Steffi's eyes flashed with a hatred that wasn't entirely for Sheila anymore, but for the man who had let her build her empire on ash. And still Ridge sat, silent now, his eyes unfocused, his breathing uneven, as though the world had tilted and he was sliding into a place he might not return from. And Taylor, realizing the danger, shouted for someone to call an ambulance, because his pulse was racing, his hands cold, and she feared that Eric's confession would claim not only his own life, but Ridge's too. And as sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each heartbeat, Eric grabbed Bridget's wrist, his old artist's hands still strong enough to command attention. And he whispered, There's one more name, one more lie in the safe, under the sketches of the first Forrester line. You'll find the truth about who should have inherited this empire. And his eyes flickered toward Zend, who suddenly felt the weight of every secretive glance his grandfather had ever given him, every cryptic word about potential and promise, and Paris, standing beside him, clutched his arm, realizing that if this next revelation was what they suspected, the Forrester throne might not belong to Ridge or Thomas or even Steffi, but to someone they had all underestimated, someone whose quiet patience might now be the sharpest blade in the room. And as the paramedics burst through the door, the mansion filled with the smell of antiseptic and panic, Eric's last words before they placed the oxygen mask over his face were a whisper carried, like a curse across generations. "Forgive me, or don't, but do not let this empire die with me." And as the doors swung shut behind the stretcher, leaving the family staring at one another in a storm of suspicion, grief, and ambition, the night truly began to fall, and with it, the certainty that nothing in the bold and the beautiful world would ever be the same again. The flashing red lights of the ambulance cast long streaks across the manicured driveway as Ridge Forrester was rushed out on a stretcher, his hand still twitching as if trying to grasp a truth that had slipped through his fingers. And behind him, the Forrester mansion vibrated with a different kind of life now. Not the celebratory glamour of a dynasty, but the electric tension of a house turned into a crime scene of secrets. Brooke followed closely, her high heels clicking like gunshots against the marble, her face pale and her eyes wide, torn between staying behind to unearth the next revelation and being at Ridge's side. Because for all their battles, betrayals, and years of yo-yo love, in this moment the man she had fought for most of her adult life looked like he might never open his eyes again, and Taylor, her hair disheveled, her blouse damp with the sweat of panic, clutched her phone to her ear, barking orders at the hospital staff as if sheer maternal desperation could guarantee her former husband's survival, while inside, Thomas prowled like a caged animal, his jaw set, his designer boots sinking into the plush carpet as he turned to Zen with eyes that held both threat and fear. Because if the name in that safe was not Ridge's, if Eric had truly orchestrated decades of false legacies, then Thomas's entire quest for power, for redemption, for love with hope, was built on a foundation that could crumble with one turn of a key, and Zen, feeling for perhaps the first time the weight of destiny pressing upon him, whispered to Paris that maybe they should be the ones to open it. Maybe this was their moment, but Paris, ever cautious beneath her poise, warned that the Forrester house had a habit of chewing up its heirs and spitting them out in scandal, and nearby, Hope sat motionless on the sofa, her hands trembling as she thought of Douglas. What would she tell him? That the family he admired, the name he wore, might not even be his own? And her heart cracked anew as memories of Liam flashed, his fierce defensive legacy for their daughter, his rivalries with Steffi, his fragile faith in the Forrester-Logan unity, all of it now tainted in Katie, her arms wrapped protectively around Donna, looked over at Bill, who had remained in the mansion despite the chaos, his phone in his hand, his mind already drafting press releases, corporate takeover strategies, custody petitions, anything that could turn this implosion to his advantage. Because Bill Spencer was many things, ruthless, cold, predatory, but above all, he was opportunistic, and if the Forrester line fractured, he would be the first to slide into the cracks, perhaps even using Eric's confession as leverage to get Steffi to finally come to him for safety, for stability, for power, and Steffi, though shaken, though her lips trembled as Finn held her close, felt a strange surge of clarity. For years she had measured herself against Brooke, fought for the Forrester name, as if it were a crown to be defended. But now, with her father's very identity in question and her grandfather gasping in the back of an ambulance, she realized that what she had truly been fighting for all along was belonging. And if that belonging was a lie, then who was she really? Her eyes darted to Finn, to the children waiting at home, to the shadow of Sheila lurking in the hall, and for the first time, she whispered, "Maybe the blood doesn't matter. Maybe we've been chained to this name for too long." And Finn, ever the calm in her storm, pressed a kiss to her forehead and told her to breathe, because the real storm was only beginning. And in the corner, Sheila Carter stepped closer to the family gathering, her presence a dark perfume that made everyone stiffen. And she said in that honeyed, dangerous tone, "You all hated me for my lies. But at least I never built an empire on them. and the words sliced through the air like a blade, making Thomas whirl on her with venom in his eyes. But he didn't strike because deep down, the shame of knowing there was some truth in her words was worse than her smirk, and Bridget, returning from the ambulance bay with a medical update, said that Ridge was stable but unconscious, his heart rate erratic, his mind under strain from what the doctors called a stress-induced episode, and Brooke nearly collapsed into her arms, whispering, "I can't lose him. Not like this, not because of this." And Taylor, standing beside her, felt the old rivalry flare and fade all in one breath. Because what was the point of fighting over a man whose very history was being rewritten by the hour? And as the night deepened, as the staff drew the curtains and the house quieted into a low hum of whispered arguments and frantic calls, Eric's last command echoed in every mind. The safe under the sketches of the first Forrester line, the hidden truth of who should have inherited this empire, and Thomas, unable to bear the suspense any longer, stormed into the study, Paris and Zend at his heels, Hope trailing behind as if pulled by invisible strings, and with shaking hands he pulled aside the heavy framed sketch of Stephanie's first collection, revealing the steel safe that had sat there for decades, its code known only to Eric and perhaps one or two ghosts of the past.